You're listening to The Solution, a podcast by Growers Mineral. I'm your host, Russell Bobel. In this ongoing series, we will be taking a look at the book More Food from Soil Science, a book written in 1965 by one of Growers' co-founders, Dr. V.A. Tietjens.
Chapter 14, The Farmer and His Profession. No other human occupation opens so wide a field for the profitable and agreeable combination of labor with cultivated thought as agriculture. Every blade of grass is a study, and to produce two where there was but one is both a profit and a pleasure. The thought recurs that education, cultivated thought, can best be combined with agriculture labor, or any labor, on the principle of thorough work, and ere long the most valuable of all arts will be the art of deriving a comfortable subsistence from the smallest area of soil. Abraham Lincoln. The problems confronting the farmer are partly his own fault and partly due to economic conditions beyond his control. One problem which he has not been able to solve, which no one has been able to solve, is how best to adapt his farming operations to the kind of weather he can expect. So far, he has had little control over the price he receives for the produce he grows. He can, of course, buy land in any location and be assured of a certain climate. Therefore, he has no idea what his yields or gross income will be and whether he will receive enough money to pay the costs of preparing the crops for market. If he cannot realize a profit when his crop has been marketed, he may work a whole season for nothing. This has a demoralizing effect and has made his profession a gamble. He must invest anywhere from $5 to $200 an acre to produce a crop before he knows what his acre return will be. One of the big problems in establishing a price that will give him a profit above his costs is the variability in yields on different farms, which, of course, cause unit costs to vary within wide limits. The ability of people to manage affairs greatly influences costs. A farmer has no way of knowing whether he will lose his crop because of a drought, a flood, a wind, or hailstorm. An early fall or late spring freeze can ruin him. His crops may be destroyed by an avalanche of insects or some plant disease, or because of unfavorable weather conditions making it impossible to cultivate his crops, he may see weeds reduce his yield to the point where the crop is not worth harvesting. As a generality, cattle farming and poultry farming have been a little surer than all-grain crop farming because pastures are not affected as much by the elements as other crops. However, cattle or poultry farming have not been a bed of roses either because they are too dependent on adequate yields of crops and prices of milk, eggs, and beef. There is a wide difference in the amount of supervision farmers must expand on their farms. A dairy farmer is probably busy the year round. A poultry farmer can be busy for 12 months out of the year. A beef cattle grower and feeder probably is busy 10 months, unless he feeds his cattle on pasture, in which case he may have several months a year for vacation. A grain farmer spends only 3 to 6 months in actual farming. A potato grower only farms 4 or 5 months out of the year. Storing and marketing the crop may add 2 months. A vegetable grower can easily spread 9 months out of the year supervising his crop. A fruit grower may spend from 6 to 9 months supervising his operations. When we consider any crop program, we must realize that the growing season from early spring frost to late fall freeze determines which months will be busy. Thus, the farmer figures out how much money he can make per month while he is busy. Certainly, the potato grower cannot expect to make 12 months' pay for 4 months' work. If he can make good wages for 12 months by working 4 months, he certainly is in good profession. Statistical portrayal of crop production total in the United States has led our uninformed proponents to paint the farm picture a rosy industry. Such data is not proven in terms of profits, and as a result, a $4 billion grain crop sounds like big money to the farmer. But when it costs $4 billion to get that much money in return, it has meant no actual profit to the farmer. A farmer's pay must be figured on his hourly wage, which includes his profit. He must not overlook the fringe benefits, such as rent and produce. On the basis of actual profits, agriculture is not a going concern for the average farmer. Any business run on the same basis would be bankrupt. Too often we have seen profits in 1 year wiped out by 2 or more years of less than cost prices. Farmers have lost their farms because of fertilizer bills, or by assuming mortgages or needed buildings and not being able to make sufficient profits or even pay the interest. 40-odd years ago, a farmer could hew himself a farm out of standing timber, erect his buildings, and by hard work build up an equity from $5 an acre land into $100 to $200 an acre land in 10 years. My father took 80 acres of land, which cost him $400, and in 7 years he cleared it, erected barns, silos, machine sheds, and a house, and sold it for $12,000. The $12,000 was clear. He owed no money. I doubt whether a person could do that today because of the high costs of things he has to buy. I remember that the first large barn, 34 feet by 60 feet, that Father built cost him $800 in actual cash. The following year, he raised 5 acres of potatoes and paid off the $800 mortgage because potatoes happened to sell for $1 to $2 a barrel. Today, that same barn built in the same community would cost $4,000, and it would take the profits from 160 acres of potatoes to pay for it. That comparison shows the reason why the farmer is in trouble today, and it is something that he can do very little about. We hear much about parity financing between industry and farming. It is not well understood. Parity assumes that a man growing farm produce should realize as high an hourly wage as the man who runs a manufacturing plant with equal capital investment. This is based on average farm income for a previous 10-year period. However, our economists have overlooked the fact that a $6,000 a year farm income may have been obtained with the help of 3 grown children and the man's wife. Many a farmer's wife have spent days driving a tractor, tending chickens and milking cows, while the farmer was doing other necessary work. I have seen 10 to 15-year-old boys and girls drive a tractor all day, and no accounting was made for this share of the $6,000 income which the farmer received. These things rarely happen in industry. The incentive that got young people started as farmers 40 years ago is no longer here. With conditions as they are today, a person does not dare to start life on a farm unless he has the money to buy land and an equal amount to buy equipment. He does not dare to assume the responsibility of a mortgage because he has absolutely no assurance that he can make enough profit to pay it off. Young married women don't put up with inconveniences that my mother did when she and my dad bought wild land and, with little cash, built a farm out of it. Some people who read this will contradict me and say that it can be done, and I will have to agree that it is being done by a few hardworking, experienced individuals who possess the love of accomplishment. But for everyone who can do it, there are 100 or more who could not make the grade. Farm life should be the most attractive and healthful vocation in the world, and yet we know it isn't. Young people don't want to stay on the farm for various and sundry reasons, and the main reason is that they cannot have the luxuries and conveniences of city life. Many want better education and have gotten it, now are attracted to the salary jobs. Farming has not paid enough to put in running water and electricity so that they could enjoy the privilege of a shower or tub bath and toilet facilities that would eliminate the outhouse in the backyard. They want to see movies and have the use of an automobile. Today, television has partially filled that need. The farmer who has been able to provide these facilities is in the upper 10% of the profession. Many estates that were built in farming areas were constructed through cheap labor, slaves, or children. The farmer with a large family was fortunate because the help he had cost him only their keep. As a result of economic and social changes which have occurred during the past 50 years, we have people farming who either love the land, have their life earnings invested and can't liquidate their investment, or are incapable of doing anything else and live on the land to glean enough food to keep from going hungry. They may use the farm as a place to live while they pursue a salary job, or they may have accumulated enough wealth to farm in spite of poor prices. We have some large farming corporations, some of which, through sound business principles, are able to make a good income, while others usually operate in the red. There are very few, however, who farm because it is a sound business enterprise. This is unfortunate, because every human being in the world is dependent on the farmer for his food. Manufacturing is dependent on the farmer for raw materials. As a nation, we must protect ourselves by protecting the farmer. We must furnish an incentive that will make people want to farm as a vocation. There are enough people who would farm if they could earn enough to give them the luxuries that they enjoy on a salary. In other words, we, as members of a society, must take sufficient interest in our agricultural industry to assure the fanner of profit sufficient for him to live as well as his city cousin. Unless we do this, we may find it impossible to buy sufficient food to nourish our bodies. We have seen this happen in China, in India, and in Russia. We can do something about it if we will. Some claim that we have reached the point where, as a world population, we do not have sufficient land to grow food to feed us. The picture is not as dark as some think, but we still have to change our economic picture considerably. It has been said that our civilization has reached the crest and that we are now on the toboggan headed for oblivion. How can we slow this descent and remain on the crest? By solving the farm problem, we can return to an even keel and stay there for centuries. There is much being written today about our diminishing food supply, our ever-increasing population, and how long our sod resources will continue to supply us with food to satisfy our needs as well as a surplus to export food-hungry nations. On the basis of what has been published during the past 150 years, the agricultural industry should be the most prosperous of any of our industries. Yet the average farmer with his low yields can't depend on the price set by supply and demand to pay his costs of production. Subsidies from the government, because we have surpluses, have been tried, but help little. We talk about our diminishing land per capita. The fact that our population has been increasing for several hundred years while we remain capable of producing more food and more raw materials than we can, more than we can use, should be a warning that perhaps our thinking has been running on the sidetrack rather than the main line. Abraham Lincoln asked several questions that we may ask ourselves in all walks of life. Do we know who we are? Do we know what we want? Do we know how to get what we want? We have had government programs to help agriculture, but none of them has actually helped to bring order out of chaos. I have heard the statement made that we need a war to restore our agriculture to prosperous levels, because a brisk demand for food raises the prices to the producer. It is true that farm prices have increased during war periods because the demand was high and the supply was just a little below demand. It was so much so that we had to restore to rationing and impose a ceiling on prices so that the consumer could buy enough food. I often wonder why we need ceilings. A person has a certain amount of money to spend. If he has to pay too much for some items, he will buy a cheaper item or a cheaper substitute. If we are going to impose seeding prices, we must also have support prices. In other words, we must subsidize agriculture. This may not be sound philosophy, but it is necessary to encourage our farmers to produce more food, and this encouragement can only come as a result of sufficiently high prices so that the farmer can depend on a profit year after year. But why should we have to do this? Why don't we subsidize other industries? Is it because the farmer has the key to maintenance of life in his hand? Perhaps Daniel Webster wrote words of real wisdom when he said, "If there is one lesson of history that is unmistakable, it is that material strength lies very near the soil." We have supported our agriculture by appropriating money for research to a higher degree than any other country. We have done this in good faith and with a certain amount of clear thinking, but I wonder whether, as Lincoln intimated, we always knew what we wanted before we appropriated money. Funds appropriated as a result of political pressure are not always spent wisely. There is much waste and duplication, and, as a result, we have burdened agriculture with something which is always open to criticism by pressure groups. However, the agriculture industry in the United States has fared well from the standpoint of receiving its share of government money. Perhaps it is the one reason why people in the United States are well supplied with food. The fact that the armed forces found much malnutrition among the draftees is no reflection on the ability of our farmers to feed them. That is a problem for our nutritionists and sociologists to solve and plays no part in our discussion. Our problem from the point of view of food supply is to decide whether we have produced enough food, how much longer we can continue to produce enough, and what means should be adopted to stimulate the production of more food. According to the law of supply and demand, which functioned to a much higher degree in the early part of the century, agriculture should prosper, but it hasn't. Perhaps we should decide why. Perhaps it doesn't apply to agriculture, in which case we make a mistake in assuming it guarantees an adequate food supply. Here are several things worthy of consideration. Has government interference in the form of special taxes, programs of curtailment, price ceilings, price controls, or other acts had some deleterious effect? Has weather had anything to do with it? Has the cost of labor anything to do with it? There are so many angles which should be studied from different viewpoints. A cursory view of these factors, I believe, shows that there are too many obstacles to permit the law of supply and demand to take care of our food supply. We can take an optimistic view of our ability to feed our people for several centuries to come, but it will require some planning based on clear thinking. The question is, can we set up a world program that will prevent starvation and famine? We do have famines in some countries. India and China have had famines. European countries have been more fortunate. It's interesting to consider them. India and China have been pointed out as places where the population exceeded the capacity of the land to feed them. Is the fault in the soil or in the government? India has a far greater population per square mile than the United States. However, I am convinced that we in the United States could easily feed as many people as India has per square mile. I can't prove this, but there are many reasons why this might be so. Transportation in India is not adequate to transport food from the areas of plenty to areas of famine, and, as a result, only wheat and other grains can be depended on, because they can be stored. However, grain must be grown in suitable areas, and a drought can easily wipe out a crop. Perishable crops must be grown close to the centers of population, unless good transportation is available. India has insufficient industry. When a nation's population is largely agricultural, cultivating land to produce food becomes a hand labor job, which relegates that part of the population to the peasant class. Each individual may provide for himself, but has little left for his city cousin. Indian agriculture has been given no support by the government. There has been no encouragement to produce food. Agricultural pursuits have not been marked by scientific methods of research. Again, we come to the possibility that a lack of land may not be the real cause. What is said of India is also true of China. The fault goes back to Daniel Webster's quotation. The old world idea was that the farmer was of the common class, fundamentally necessary to the world, but not capable of entering into the governing body. We can be heartened by the fact that our dunking in this country has gotten away from the idea that anyone who can't do anything else can be a farmer. Agriculture cannot be a dumping ground for humanity. A successful farmer today must be well trained in the sciences and of keen mind. The Romans took a different point of view. When they wanted to commend anyone, they said the tillers of the soil made the best soldiers, were the best husbands, and were the best source of state leaders. Italy has had no famines. Germany and the Low Countries looked after their agriculture. They realized that a happy, contented man was one who had enough food. They set up experimental stations to study problems of the sod, to help the farmers maintain the productiveness of the land. They, too, supported their industry. The fact that a fanatic came into power and caused the downfall of Germany is beside the point in this discussion. What has happened in France and Spain is a good example of what happens when a government overlooks its agriculture and industry. In this connection, we can examine the communistic state. In Russia, we have a good example of lack of coordination between science and the agricultural industry. Russia is supporting the agriculture industry by research, but the machinery to get scientific facts into the hands of the farmer has become disorganized. Communal living and government farming are not conducive to a strong agriculture. We must have free enterprise among farmers as well as among industrialists. Part of the success that our farmers have enjoyed is due to the fact that they could carry on their operations with a minimum of interference. Communal living discourages initiative. There may be some advantages for the man who can't think and has no ambition, but some other means should be provided for his welfare. This is a sociological problem which should not be heaped on shoulders of the agricultural profession. This should be the concern of the government and should be divorced from agriculture. Such people must work under direct supervision. Many of them do make up the laboring class on our farms. Good examples of government interference are the tariff and certain types of taxes, such as the tax on butter substitute. People in the United States will take certain regulations up to a certain point, and then they rebel. The supporters of taxes on butter substitutes will soon find that they have cut off their noses to spite their faces. The price of butter is high because the supply does not meet the demand. Furthermore, there is little indication that it ever will. The tax on oleomargarine is a spite tax, rather than any help to the butter interests. As people become educated and realize that vegetable oils are as nutritious as butter, the per capita consumption of butter will decrease. This will hurt the butter producers. With present costs of producing butter, even high prices will not encourage the expansion of the industry. Dairy farming is hard work. The younger generation doesn't want to be tied down to milking cows. Dairying developed because of the low price of family labor. A man with a large family makes a big profit in the dairy business, and as long as he can command his teenagers to work for him, he will continue to make a profit. The dairy farmer will be supplanted by the fat stock man because the stock grower can get along with much less labor. The high cost of labor is going to be responsible for many changes in our agricultural pursuits. When people can make good wages in industry by working 40 hours per week, they want equivalent hourly wages for the 50 to 60 hours they work on the farm. When our dairy interests realize this, they will try fairer means of helping their interests than killing competition by taxation. The dairy industry will become a fluid milk business, developing closer to population centers or within feasible hauling distance of such areas. How about the price ceilings and support prices? Price ceilings tend to discourage production for the reason that boards who sit together to set those ceiling prices are composed of those who have a high degree of efficiency in their operations. I have in mind a survey made in a community where tomatoes were produced for the fresh market. The costs of growing tomatoes for 100 farmers ranged from 40 cents to $2.25 a bushel. A good selling price would be $1.80. After a few years, those who produced with costs close to or above the selling price will discontinue growing tomatoes. Interference by the government can be good or bad. Regulations on price spread between the producers and the consumer would help improve any industry. We need people who handle produce and commodities. The fact that we have so many is an indication that profits are lucrative. A fair profit, which would become lucrative only by handling large volumes, would be permissible. The present system of large profits for the middleman is on the way out. Too often these profits have put the producer out of business. But if we are to assure ourselves of adequate food supplies, we must encourage more people to produce. The government support price based on parity has many weaknesses. We could support ourselves right out of the picture when it is based on parity. The 1948 support price on potatoes is a good example. By the time the potatoes reach the consumer, he won't be able to pay for them, and the demand for potatoes will increase. Such practices are responsible for initiating vicious circles which do us more harm than good. If the retail price is too high, the laboring man strikes for more wages. This in turn boosts prices still further. We have many groups looking for special favors who do not realize that as they demand and get more, they must pay for it, whether through taxes or commodity prices. As a result, we have demanded ourselves to a level where, we can't do business with neighboring countries, so we set up tariffs to protect ourselves. If our neighbors had the money and could buy our agricultural surpluses, we wouldn't need support prices. There is a big demand outside of our own walls for more food than we can produce. Democracy is a wonderful institution, but it will be short-lived if we don't do something or adjust our economic life. A high standard of living is of little value to the populace if we can't enjoy prosperity. Many of us feel that we must have plenty of money to spend in order to be happy, and our aim seems to be to acquire more. As a matter of fact, we probably have less money to spend now than we did 50 years ago. To be prosperous, we must produce more per capita. The present system has developed a number of weaknesses and inequalities. High wages immediately starts talk of inflation, but when only one group gets high wages while the farmer and the white-collar workers are underpaid, it is difficult to see why we should have inflation. If people buy only in proportion to the money they have to spend, there is little danger of inflation. Inflation comes from easy-to-obtain credit. This hurts agriculture because people cannot buy the food they need. If the government wants to help agriculture, a curb on credit would do more good than a support price. A person tied down with heavy monthly bills cannot buy high-priced food. This is partly the reason why we have malnutrition and starvation in the midst of plenty. We need closer coordination between industry and agriculture. The only agency that can do this is our federal government, but any program should be the product of thinkers, not politicians. It is not the job of politicians to establish a program. It is their job to put it into effect after it is agreed upon. Furthermore, the world situation must be taken into consideration. This is more difficult, not so much from the standpoint of European as from Asiatic countries. It may be that subsidies to foreign countries may be a better method of world distribution for our surpluses than subsidized crops in this country. Our standard of living is the result of our wage scale in relation to that enjoyed by our foreign neighbors. The upper limit of our wage level is responsible for the rapid advance in the adoption of automation in our factories, which, of course, is increasing the ranks of the unemployed. Industry is adopting automation to keep solvent. Thus, the seesaw between the survival of industry and labor unions continues to increase prices. This creates friction, not only between industry and agriculture, but between the United States and foreign countries. Thus, if we would carry on trade with our foreign neighbors, we must subsidize our agriculture or loan monies to our foreign neighbors. We do have the possibility of shortages in this country, and I would much rather have a surplus every year than control acreage too closely. Any tax for surplus produce would be a justifiable burden on society in general. The question then is, how can the farmer produce that additional yield per acre, and how will that affect our national economy? Well, the answer to that question involves a number of considerations. It's generally safe to say that the average American farmer has at his disposal information which would enable him to farm much better than he does. Experiment stations, the country over, must advise him how to increase his yields considerably above the average, even though they may not have the information to tell the food grower how to achieve his maximum yield, which is 2 to 3 times the average yield. If we analyze the situation, we can, for simplicity, say that 1/3 of the farmers produce below average yields, 1/3 produce average yields, and 1/3 produce above average yields. This varies with localities. There are isolated areas which support higher average yields than others. A good example is the California potato growing area, which produces 300 bags, whereas the area in Tidewater, Virginia, produces an average of less than 100 bags. And yet there are growers in Tidewater who produce, on occasion, 350 bags per acre, just as there are growers in California who produce 500 bags per acre. Thus, sod conditions have a big influence on potato yields. It has been my privilege to see 150 bushels of corn per acre harvested, where the average yield is 30 bushels, 1,000 bushels of spinach per acre, where the average is 230 bushels, 85 bushels of oats, where the average is 27 bushels, and 504 bushels of sweet potatoes, where the average is 83 bushels an acre. The first thing that comes to one's mind is that better sods were responsible. But in not one of the cases mentioned was this true. It was due to superior cultural conditions. It convinces me that good yields can be produced on all of our farmlands, even though they may not always be profitable yields. One thing that we can be sure of is that a very small percentage of our growers grow as good a crop as is possible for the prevailing weather conditions in a given area. Our crops are grown from water and sunshine, with a little fertilizer and lime to make it possible for the plant to make use of the sunshine that it receives. A corn plant contains 80% water and 20% dry matter, of which less than 1% is ash or lime and fertilizer that was applied to the soil. The remainder of the dry matter is made by the action of synthesizing sunshine and carbon dioxide in the air, and moisture taken from the sod through the roots and dew taken in through the leaves. And yet this dry matter per acre is far from the quantity that could be produced. A 300-bushel spinach crop produces 720 pounds of dry matter for food, while a 50-bushel corn crop produces 3,000 pounds in grain and cob, and another 3,600 pounds in the fodder. It costs $81 to grow the spinach and $41 to grow the corn. The cash returns on the spinach could be from $225 to $600 an acre, while from corn it could be from $37 to $75 an acre. From the standpoint of food energy, there is far more in corn than in spinach. Corn, therefore, becomes a cheap land crop, while spinach can be grown in the shadow of Radio City. The farmer can gamble with spinach while he has to be much more conservative with corn. The man who grows 50 bushels of corn probably would not dare risk a spinach crop. Spinach is a perishable crop that must be marketed quickly, while corn may be stored and sold at top price. In other words, we have the intensive truck grower and the extensive field crop grower, to say nothing of fruit growers, cotton, tobacco, wheat, and potato growers, each growing a different type of crop, each crop requiring special handling, but each crop doing well on the same sod type, each with an adequate level of fertility and lime that must be maintained in the soil. We can go further and say that a man's genetic background or makeup plays an important part in how successful he can be with such a crop. Each and every one has available information to do better than he has been doing with his particular crop, and yet it isn't being done. This is shown by the consistency with which our average yields remain the same from year to year. The average yield for potatoes in 1945 was 151 bushels per acre. If that yield should happen to be increased 20 bushels per acre, it would have increased our production from 430,773,000 bushels to 486,773,490 bushels. And if it were increased to 200 bushels per acre, it would produce a total crop of 538,466,250 bushels. This could happen, but probably won't, because many factors control our yields, and farmers are not all equally good potato growers. Prices will be determined by supply and demand. Our total crop, to a certain extent, will fluctuate. Acre yields, which determine the number of dollars that a farmer makes, are affected by weather conditions, prevalence of insects, and disease, amount of fertilizer applied, and soil conditions. The farmer who gets those big yields knows how to handle each one and sees that practices are followed through. So we have not only a cultural problem, but an education problem. How far we can go with our educational problem is a question. If we use average yields as our criteria, progress will be slow. There's another trend that is being felt. The per capita consumption of potatoes is decreasing, giving way to other truck crops. There is less need for high-energy foods. The proportion of white-collar people to laborers is increasing. The demand for high-energy foods is decreasing, while the demand for high-vitamin foods is increasing. The lettuce-tomato sandwich is gradually taking the place of the potato and gravy diet. This has a disturbing influence on our crop-producing areas. Farmers must stay on their toes if they would keep abreast of the times.
Thanks for listening, everyone, to this episode of The Solution. If you'd like to learn more about the Growers Program or anything you heard in this podcast, visit our website at growersmineral.com. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss another episode. Thanks. We'll see you guys in the next episode.